I find this a great honor to be seated here because I remember the time that I came to for the Mathrubhumi International Festival of Letters last year as a host, and I was asked by my professor to read this book, The Swaraj Spy, and come back to college and conduct a session with Mr. Vijay Balan. So I was so apprehensive whether I can, conduct a session with him, talk about a book that deals with historical fiction. And I managed to read the book in 1 to 2 weeks, and I returned back to college, and we conducted the event, the discussion, a book discussion about Swaraj Spy very successfully in my college back in St. Teresa's College, Ernakulam. So to begin with, this is, as she introduced, this is Vijay Balan. And this book is a book that deals with historical fiction, a genre in which the plot takes place in a setting that is related to the past events, but it is quite fictional. A historical work that is quite interspersed with fictional elements. So to begin with, he, as she told in the introduction, that he is a person who grew up in Ooty, and he has worked in the aerospace and fintech industries in many parts of the world. So as an avid history buff, as you told about yourself in the profile, and also a person who has traveled very extensively all around the world, to begin with, can you, actually just introduce the book to people around here, because they might not have actually, read the book. There are many people who are very unfamiliar to your work, The Swaraj Spy. So can you kindly set up the story arc of The Swaraj Spy and make this conversation engaging?
Thank you, Maxlin. I'm happy to do that. So let me first of all describe something called the Indian National Army, or the INA. You all probably know about this, but I'll repeat it in any case. You've all heard about India's freedom movement using nonviolence and so on. There was another group that used a very, very different approach. The Indian National Army was made up of prisoners of war, Indian prisoners of war who had surrendered. And the idea was to get them to switch sides. Not a lot of people know this. 2 million Indian soldiers fought for Britain in World War II. So the idea was, if you could get even a small percentage of those soldiers to switch sides, Britain would get knocked out of the war and India would gain independence. So, and many of you have heard about the INA and Subhash Chandra Bose and so on. But let me ask you an interesting question. If I ask you to name the first leader of the INA, my guess is all of you will say, of course, it's Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose, and you would be wrong, because there was an INA before that one, which was led by a man called Captain Mohan Singh, and that INA collapsed because of tensions between the Japanese and the Indians. The Japanese had their own agenda, like all big powers do, and that led to that army's collapse. So that's by the historical backdrop. This book is really about my granduncle, my father's mother's brother, who was with an organization called the Malabar Special Police, the MSP. And in 1931, he was asked to disperse a group of protesters in Madras. When he got up close to that the group, he found that they were all women, so he refused to carry out the order. So they fired him. So he went back to Kozhikode, which is his hometown, and he tried his hands at business, but the Great Depression came in and wiped out his business. And he had gotten married, and he was at a loose end, and he moved to Singapore for better times. This was before the war. And he got an odd job, and he was trying to make enough money to bring his wife over. Then World War II started. Most people don't know that at the same time Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, they also bombed Singapore at exactly the same time. So now all of a sudden he's caught behind enemy lines. But in Singapore, he met a few people, including Mr. KPK Menon, who is the founder of the Mathrubhumi paper, this publication that has sponsored this event, or the organizer of this event. And he and a couple of others were people who were instrumental in creating this thing that was called the INA. So he convinced my granduncle, his name is T.P. Kumaran Nair, there's a road named after him in Calicut, to join this spy school. And it was a secret spy school in Penang, where he was first a cadet and then an instructor. And the courses were all conducted by Japanese intelligence, but the management was shared between the Japanese and the Indians. And when 20 cadets from the school were sent to India, before they were ready by the Japanese, because they were in a hurry, without telling their Indian counterparts, they were captured by the British because a double agent told them that these agents were coming. So my granduncle was sent on a rescue mission. But a rescue mission with very different instructions. The Japanese told him to go find the survivors and continue the mission, which is to spy on British installations. The Indians, the INA told him to identify the survivors and hide because they did not trust the Japanese. So this book is about what happened to him, what his journey from Penang through the jungles of Malaya and back into India and the twists and turns. It's also about his wife waiting for him back in India, not knowing whether he was alive or dead. And really, this is a book about two people dealing with events, global events, which are far beyond their control and how it affects their lives. The book is the result of 6.5 years worth of research. I live in the US. I made several trips here to India, to the Far East, put documents together. I managed to get my hands on letters that he had written, which allowed me to get into his mind. And it is fascinating to see how he had moved from being kind of a gung-ho, take that hill kind of officer, to someone who's kind of contemplative about the whole human condition. So that's the book. It's a book of 3 journeys, as I often tell people. It's his own physical journey from Kozhikode to Madras to Singapore to Penang to Rangoon and back to India, a big circle, counterclockwise. The second is his own journey of personal transformation, which I just alluded to. And the third is India's own tumultuous march to independence. So that's the Swaraj Spy.
So thank you, Vijay, for such a detailed introduction of the book. I think so many of the people who didn't know what the book is about have got a correct, an answer to what the book is about. So can you now tell us about the title that you have named for the Swaraj Spy? How did you come about? How did you decide on such a befitting title for your book?
Okay, 3 reasons. The word Swaraj in Sanskrit actually means self-rule, right? And it was a slogan during the freedom movement. The great Lokmanya Tilak famously said, "Swaraj is my birthright and I shall have it." That's one reason. Second, the spy school that he was trained in Penang, it was called the Indian Swaraj Institute. Third is, as I just alluded to, his whole journey of personal discovery allows him to find a Swaraj, a self-rule of a very different kind. So those are the 3 reasons why I chose the title, The Swaraj Spy.
So in this current generation, why did you think that people will be interested in something from the past? So how did you decide that you're going to write a historical fiction, but not a fiction, a sheer fiction?
Well, okay. So on the fiction part, I've used fiction as a vehicle to basically convey researched facts. Almost a good part of that book is factual. And the reason why I did that is because I believe history is really his story. It's a story. So it needs to be told as a story. Because I think school systems the world over do a disservice in the way they teach history. It's rote learning and people say, oh my God, history. So that's why I chose that genre. But as to why people might be interested, I'll give you an anecdote. This happened. So a cousin of mine and I, as part of my research, we went to Madras. In the book, you'll find that these letters that I talked about, that I found copies of, he actually got them smuggled past censors through a house in Madras. And I knew the address of that house. It's in an area of Madras or Chennai today, called Vepuri, Mathrubhumi Street. So my cousin and I landed up there one fine morning on Mathrubhumi Street, knocked at the first door, and there was this young lady in the house. She had a sari kind of tucked up, and she had a ladle, a chattugam, as we say in Malayalam, in one hand, with turmeric on her face. And so she's asked me in Tamil, "Enna venum?" And I can speak Tamil. So I told her that, look, this is why I'm here, about my granduncle and so on. And she kind of gave me a weird look. And she said, "Appadiya, ungalai kandippa udavi seyanum," which means, is that right? I definitely have to help you. She spent 3 hours with us, complete strangers, two guys who showed up on a bike. And back then I had more hair. By the way, this is what writing a book does to you. But two guys with long hair and beards, and she took us from house to house to house. And each house, people welcomed us, gave us coffee, sent a little boy running down to say, okay, go look at this house, that house. In the end, we could not find the house because the numbering systems had changed. But it was unbelievable how people welcomed two complete strangers because of this story. So I think there is still a tremendous amount of interest and curiosity in these unknown and unsung stories of our past. And so, it was a great question. Why should people care? And what I'm trying to tell you is that people do care. They just have to be told.
Because it's so disheartening the way we study history, because all of the students out here we just understand, or we just mug up all the dates that's been told in the history textbooks, and there is no history textbook that teaches about the Kanakakunnu Palace or the significance of Trivandrum. So in that way, it's very important and very vital to read this book that discusses about the history of independence. So how come could you actually believe in the power of your uncle's your grand uncle's narrative, and what do you think is the the relevance of oral narrative these days?
Okay, so Mark Twain once said that history doesn't always repeat itself, but it rhymes. So I think knowing the past allows us to put the present in some context. Because take a look at it. Back then, what they were dealing with was a small power, India, which was not yet independent, sandwiched between two great powers vying for global dominance, the United States and Great Britain, and Japan and Germany. Fast forward to today, you have the United States and you've got China just above the northern border, vying for global dominance, and a middle power like India sandwiched in between. So this whole notion of knowing about the past, I think helps us kind of at least put the present in some context. In terms of my granduncle himself, this is a story that my father had told me as I was growing up. To my father, this man was a great hero. So the bits and pieces of that story were rattling around in my head until one day I had an epiphany. I said, hey, I should tell this story. So I went on the web to see what was there. There was nothing. The trail was not only cold, it was frozen. There was permafrost on it. And so that embarked me upon a journey. But the process of discovery, not just the factual part of the geopolitics of what happened, and the fact that the Japanese had her own agendas and they were not necessarily the good guys in the whole thing, that's there. But the part that I learned a lot about was, what does the savagery of war and wartime, what does it do to people, right? What does it do to lives? Because I think there is a tendency to romanticize war, and most of the movies, the people dying, it's all bloodless, it's all very, antiseptic. But the reality is very, very different. And so that taught me a lot.
Vijay, when you skim through the book, that what we find is a different visual writing style that catches your attention. So as you find, there are some binoculars scattered throughout the pages. So could you please tell us, about the significance of insertion of such images in your book? Does it have any role to play with the Indian Army or your quest for historical research?
Right. So the cover of the book, as you can see, if you can see from the back there. It's got a pair of binoculars. There's the Union Jack on one side, and it's got the Japanese flag on the other side. And so the whole idea is to play on the notion of a spy, because he's spying through these field glasses. But one side is Japan, and the other side is England. And so those little scene breaks that you see in the book, they kind of echo that theme. So it's just kind of a visual mechanism that we use to deal with it. But you alluded to my visual style, and I tend to be a visual writer. And the way I look at it is this: I'm asking you as a reader to invest time to come with me to a different place in time, right? So I need to be a good tour guide. I need to take you there. I need to make you feel as if you are seeing, hearing, smelling, and feeling what my characters are going through. And so that is the reason why I chose that particular style, because partly because it appeals to me, but partly because what I wanted to do is make the history less overbearing and basically tell a story so that the history is kind of Trojan horse, so to speak. Actually, a reader did call me after she read the book, and she said, it's only after I read the book and put it away that I realized I'd learned a lot of history. So that was my objective. I wasn't writing for scholars. I wasn't even writing for people who are history buffs. I was just writing for people who like good storytelling. And through that vehicle, what I wanted to do was to tell the story of this granduncle of mine.
You told us that you have an affinity for the visual writing style. So do you think visions play an important role in learning history? Or how should the history textbooks be framed? Or how should the pedagogy of history be framed in the times? What do you think about that?
Well, I tell you, I mean, as I said earlier, I think school systems the world over do a terrible
It's
job.
very disheartening.
To make history interesting. But in my case, I had a wonderful teacher who kind of instilled this passion for history in my mind. For a living, I did different things. I'm an aerospace guy, and I worked on rocket engines and did mundane things like that. But I had this teacher in the school that I went to in Ooty. He was a Canadian. His name was Donald Fox. And so imagine this portly man with a red beard. And we were in fifth standard, as we used to call it, in fifth grade, whatever. So he was, and he had lived in India. He was a student in our school. He was a teacher in our school. So he knew a lot about India. He was teaching us about Shivaji and Aurangzeb. So he, again, this big portly man, and he'd walk from one side to the other side of the room. He said Aurangzeb would walk like this, and Shivaji would come like a wasp and sting him, and then he would turn around, and then he'd walk the other way, and Shivaji would sting him here. We were roaring with laughter. And I tell you, all these years ago, later, many decades later, I can remember that lesson. He also got us to, talking about visual, he got us to draw comic books. 2x6, 2x2 frames, even though comic books were banned in our school because they destroyed your English, right? So we were not allowed to read comic books, and of course we smuggled them under our sweaters. But he then went against his own rules, and he made us draw comic books. So we actually drew pictures, and there's nothing like a visual that helps imprint a certain piece of knowledge in your mind. And all these years later, I can remember those comics. I can remember that school. So absolutely. So to your point, I think that the way history is taught has to be completely re-examined. It has to be made much more interesting, and it's not really rote learning. And it also I think it should allow students to go think out of the box and say, okay, this happened. What do you think it means? For today and for tomorrow, and that part's not done. Maybe it's done at the university level, but I think that should be brought down even to the school level. And I think a lot of more kids, will get interested in history, and maybe someday they'll write a book like I did.
So do you think the moral aspects of such historical events be discussed in a school or a college level?
Okay, so it depends. I mean, this whole notion of going beyond the words and having people think out of the box, at different levels it would mean different things. So if you're talking about a graduate student, obviously you're asking for a much more in-depth level of analysis. But if you're talking about a fifth grade kid, you know, what does that mean is a whole different question. But it's not a question of in 1526, you know, Babur and Ibrahim Lodi fought the first battle of Panipat. Okay, move on, next date, next date, next date. So that's dry and boring. But this whole notion of, okay, what I just described with Mr. Fox, he had actually taught us what guerrilla warfare meant without using the word guerrilla warfare, right? So there are ways in which I think teaching can be made much more interesting than it is today.
Yes, we'll come back to the methods of teaching towards the end of the discussion. So now I thought I should ask you regarding, that historical fiction versus non-fiction, and how much of fiction have you actually incorporated into the novel? Because you have a great responsibility of keeping up the solemnity of the historical records that your grand uncle told you. So how much of a amount of fiction has actually been into the novel?
Okay, so in the back of my book there is an author's notes section where I have fessed up. I have told you where I've changed the narrative and of characters that I've introduced. But a vast majority of my work is fact-based. As I said, I've used fiction as a vehicle to convey those facts. So, I don't want to hazard a percentage, but my guess is that, I don't know, 70% of the book is fact and 30% is just creative license to help convey the story. And a little bit, as I said in my author's notes section, I've told you where I've introduced characters which I have not verified. And I've also told you where I've moved something from where it actually happened to some other place for creative reasons.
Vijay, in the beginning, you actually made us remind about the INA. So, do you think the INA really, succeeded? So, can you just share the legacy of INA to us on your perspective?
Okay, that's a terrific question.
How do you perceive INA?
That's a terrific question. So, everyone knows that the INA was crushed militarily by the British. So, I think the Japanese actually missed an opportunity, because by 1942 they had pushed the British out of Burma, and had they continued into India, and had they used the INA like the Indian Army used the Mukti Bahini in Bangladesh in 1971, they would have been able to, I think, get a good part of the British Indian Army to change sides. But the Japanese did not. They stopped at the Burma border because they had other things to do, like fighting Americans. So I can understand their logic, right? So then they finally attacked India in 1944, but by then it was too late. Britain had rearmed. There were tons and tons and tons of American supplies were there, and General Slim's 14th Army just pushed into Burma and crushed the INA. So the INA failed tactically, but I believe it succeeded strategically, and let me explain why. Because after the end of the war, the prisoners, the INA were taken as prisoners, and they were tried at the Red Fort in Delhi. And these were open trials, and they chose 3 prisoners as kind of marquee prisoners to try. One was Shahnawaz, Dhillon, and Sehgal, a Sikh, a Muslim, and a Hindu. And the British intent was to try them for treason and execute them as an example to never rise up again, okay? And they made it a public trial as opposed to an in-camera trial. But what happened was that just lit the country on fire. There was just a huge uprising, public uprising against that. Bullabhai Desai was the man who fought the case. Pandit Nehru donned his lawyer's robes and he was part of the trial. At the end of the story, the British acquitted these 3 men and all other men. In 1946, the Indian Navy mutinied. It's called the Royal Indian Navy Mutiny or the Rhin Mutiny. So, and Clement Attlee, who was the prime minister when India got independence, supposedly said, and this is hearsay, he was speaking to the acting governor of Bengal, a man called Chakravarti, And he supposedly said that one of the reasons we left India is because we could not rely on the Indian armed forces. And so if that is true, I believe the INA succeeded strategically. They did get independence for India, although they were crushed militarily. So that's my view. I think they actually did achieve their strategic ends, but at a great cost.
Thank you, Vijay. So now you have talked about the war, the repercussions, the INA, the freedom struggle. So why did you choose such topics, such matters for your debut novel? So what propelled you as a writer? Is it your schooling in OT, or is your work in the aerospace industry?
Not
A
really.
travel from your a science sector to history and all.
Yeah. So I mean, I've always been a history buff ever since Mr. Fox put that bug in my head, and I've always loved language. And I grew up in a beautiful place, so I like beauty. I like trying to represent that beauty with the written word. But what I did to put food on the table, and believe me, I enjoyed my career in aerospace and so on, and in management, was very different from what I was passionate about. And what I was always passionate about is language and history. And so why this particular story is because what I had said earlier. My dad had planted this story in my head. And I initially started out saying, look, I mean, here, this is an interesting story. It needs to be told. And then as I dug further and further into it, the story actually pulled me in. And I just became a part of it. And it took me 6.5 years of research and writing to come up with my first draft. And another 7 years of knocking on doors to get a publisher to publish me, because for a debut writer to get a publisher is very hard. But in the end, I was very fortunate. HarperCollins has published my book. So it became kind of a mission for me that initially I wanted to write the book to tell the story, but later on became a mission saying, I'm going to get this book out. So in the end, it happened.
So as you talked about the difficulties of an aspiring writer or to publish one such book, so what would you like to, tell us about your experience of getting this book published and, quite good tips for aspiring writers of historical fiction. Some of the students are also seated here in the back. So what would you like to, inform them?
One thing that I would suggest is be very...
Particularly historical fiction.
Okay, but what I'm going to say, I think, will echo in other genres as well. The one thing that I would suggest is be pretty clear as to who the audience is that you're going to write for. Now, having said that, you can't micro-target that segment, because in the end, people will read what they will read. But in my case, I made a decision pretty early on that I was just going to write this for anybody that likes good storytelling. So right there, I made a choice of not writing a scholarly book. Although I could have done that, but I made that choice. So once you make that choice as to the audience, a lot of it flows from there. The second is research. I think the more I dug into this subject, and this comes back to historical work, the story told itself, and all I had to do was to be a good custodian of the story. But dig hard, and especially when you're writing about unknown or little known history, it's really hard because the sources of information are not easily available, and you just need to dig, and you need a great amount of luck to go with that as well. And the third thing that I would say is don't get discouraged. Keep at it, especially for a first-time writer. And eventually things will work out. And the last thing I will say is this: don't do it for the money. There's very little money in this. Do it for your passion. If you are an extremely well-known author who has sold millions of books, that's a different ballgame. But otherwise, do it because this is something you want to do, and just don't take no for an answer.
So speaking on the amount of research that went into the novel, so how meticulously was your research structured and framed? because it's something that you took from your grand uncle. So we believe it's quite difficult. So how did you went about your research, taking up historical facts?
Yeah, so I told you it's all started with these little bits and pieces that were planted in my mind, and then I did a fair amount of traveling. And I started with the family, and I got my hands on letters that he had written and so on. But with family research, there's an interesting thing you got to be careful about, especially if it's a family hero. There is a risk of making it a hagiography because, I mean, he's Superman. He can jump over tall buildings in a single bound kind of thing. And so you have to be pretty honest with yourself and cross-check sources. And there was a lot I left out because I just didn't, pass the sniff test. So that was one. The second was just networking. One person led me to another, to another, to another. And I'll tell you another interesting story. I was in India. I was in Coimbatore. We have a house there. And I was, sharing the story of this book with a cousin of mine who's a retired colonel in the Indian Army. And he said, "Hey, I've heard this story before." And I said, "What?" He said, "Yeah, I've heard this story before." And I said, "Who did you hear it from?" And he said, "There's this old man who lives in the building across my building in Pune." And I said, "What's his name?" And he told me his name. And I know there were 34 men that were trained in that institute in Penang. By the way, the majority of them were Malayalis. So there's a whole role that Kerala played in all of this, which is also not known. So I said, "Wow, this man is still there." So I jumped on a plane, went to Pune. I spoke to this man. He was in his mid-90s. He was sharp. He could remember a lot of things. And so that was some other part of the research. Third thing is, one thing about the British, they wrote everything down. They took meticulous notes and they put it down on paper, except for the things that they didn't want you to know, which good luck trying to find that out. So after a lot of effort, I was able to find their reports on this particular spy school, and they were keeping track of it because they had double agents. And I will give a little bit of it away, but I won't give too much of it away. The double agent, after the war, he was promoted to full colonel, and he was given the George Cross, which is the second highest award of gallantry after the Victoria Cross. It's like your Mahavir Chakra. So they were keeping tabs. The British were keeping tabs. They had an incredible intelligence network, the British did. So I was able to incorporate a lot of that as well. And as I told you earlier, the more I dug, the more fascinating the story got. It was just, the story told itself.
So that was actually an affirmation, on the power of oral narrative by your neighbor, I believe. How he told about the experience that he had with...
Right.
Yes, right. So you describe yourself as a great traveler. So do you think that travel can, help one in understanding history? Now we are seated in a place of historical significance. So
true. I mean, the work that I did was global in nature. So I did business in many different countries. And one of the things that I love is learning about different cultures, different languages. And whenever I go to a country where I don't speak the language, one of the first things that I do is I turn on the television and I just get used to the cadence of the language, even though I don't understand a word. And the other thing is that I tend to be a keen observer. So when I see certain types of body language, certain ways in which people use their expressions or even their words, it just gets filed into a database somewhere in my head. And so I think that travel and that experience helps because a lot of it comes out later on when I'm writing in different ways. And it may be something that a good part of the story is set in Malaya, today's Malaysia, and Singapore and Burma. And some of the descriptions and things that I mentioned are the result of my trips there, right? Having said that, going to modern day Singapore doesn't help because it's all steel and glass. It doesn't tell you what Singapore looked like back then. So back to your research question, I must have spent days or months, if you put up put together all of the hours I spent on YouTube videos, just looking at it. What did old Singapore look like? What did old Rangoon look like? What does an air raid sound like, right? So all of that tends to help. So both personal observation in my travel as well as looking at old videos and so on, and all of that goes in. It goes into some database, as I said, and then it just rattles around there, and out pops prose. And I have no clue how that happens. ChatGPT will replace me down the road, but until then. So.
So, as a person who has a lot of affinity for history, I would like to ask you, how does the historical sites that we have in India actually, contribute to a greater awareness to history? Do you think those sites help us, help the new generation in any way?
This country is so incredibly rich in history that goes back millennia. Having said that, I think what I find, and I'm just being honest with you, we as a people do a pretty poor job maintaining our monuments. A lot of them are in disrepair, and a lot of the museums leave a lot to be desired. And so I wish there was more of a consciousness and more of an effort to preserve the rich history that we have in terms of physical landmarks and things of that sort. And also, I think what happens is that, take the history of Kerala, for example. Very few people know much about the history of Kerala, right? So about the Malabar region, the Cochin region, the Travancore region, and so on. Not much known, right? So we don't do as good a job, I believe, as we could in being able to stitch together the histories of different. How much do we know about the Northeast, right? How much do we know about the history of the Ahom people? We don't. So I wish more attention was paid to that, both in terms of from a narrative point of view, but also from the point of view of the physical maintenance of these incredible buildings and historical sites. Yeah.
So I think we can, donate some time to read some of the lines from your book so that the audience get to know how the book has been structured. Okay. How does it feel like to read the Swaraj Spy?
All right, fine. I will read a passage here, and let me set it up for you. This is my granduncle, Kumar, evacuating his sister Tangam and their two children, Suku and Sulu, from Singapore in the middle of a Japanese bombing raid. And Kumar is accompanied by his two brothers-in-law, one who goes by the initials AM. I won't explain why. And the other one is Gopal. All right? So here goes. On the day of their departure, Tangam, Sulu, and Suku climbed into an RAF truck. Kumar drove while AM and Gopal sat in the back along with two small suitcases. As they neared the harbor, cars and vans jostled horse carts and rickshaws laden with people carrying large bundles. Drivers leaned heavily on their horns as if sound could part the traffic. A huge throng pushed and elbowed its way from a sea of abandoned vehicles to the docks. The Keppel docks in Singapore, a source of British pride, had controlled commerce between the Far East and the Indian Ocean. But round-the-clock bombing had reduced hubris to rubble. Roofless warehouses now gaped at the sky. A dockside crane lay sprawled on its side, its legs twisted in grotesque angles like a giant squashed insect. The funnels of a sunken steamer rose out of the water like pillars supporting the dark clouds of smoldering ash that asphyxiated everyone's lungs. Kumar, AM, and Gopal linked arms to form a protective ring around Tangam and the children. They shuffled slowly as the crowd carried them forward. It took all their strength to keep the shield intact. Yells and cries in many languages tore through the air. Sulu gripped a suitcase with one hand and wrapped her other arm tightly around her mother. Tangam tightly held the precious boarding permits and the second suitcase in one hand and clutched onto Suku with the other. They tried hard to keep their balance. The melee threw the little band about like driftwood washed ashore. They reached a gate beyond which armed soldiers allowed only passengers to pass. Policemen desperately tried to control the crowd. Kumar steered the group to Royal Navy officers checking boarding permits. A swarm of hands waving pieces of paper besieged the four harried officers. Checking permits against identification was impossible. The officers looked quickly at permits and yelled instructions to the gate sentries about the number of passengers. 2, 4, 3. AM let Kumar's hands go to get the papers from Thangam. He thrust the sweat-soaked permit at a sub-lieutenant. A torn epaulette bearing his rank insignia dangled from his shoulder. The officer looked absently at the permit, jerked his head at a guard and yelled, 3. AM stuffed the papers back in Thangam's hand as she moved forward with the children. The soldier glanced at the papers and grunted, ship number 4, there. He pointed at a ship anchored 100 yards away. The ship's name had been hastily painted over in black. There was no time for goodbyes. Thangam met AM's gaze and smiled for a brief second. The crowd swallowed her and the children as it surged towards the ship like a tidal wave of heads. Kumar, AM, and Gopal tried to see the travelers board the ship, but the police quickly shooed them away. The crowd pulled in different directions towards 2 ships. Thangam kept her eye on her ship's funnel and dragged the children with all her strength towards her ship. Her carefully pulled tight bun came loose and wavy hair twisted crazily about her shoulder. Sulu used the suitcase in her hand as an instrument to push people away. She ignored hurled curses and helped her mother as much as she could. They were halfway to the ship when the air raid sirens went off. The crowd surged forward as one mass, jammed together with no room to take cover. Bombers appeared over the harbor in 2 giant Vs. Anti-aircraft guns let out deafening bangs. A shudder ran through the crowd, at first as frightened screams rang from all directions. After the first few shells, they ignored the guns and pushed relentlessly towards the ship. The bombs fell like hail. Thangam prayed their ship would not be struck. Oil storage tanks at one end of the harbor exploded into flames. A few bombs fell on warehouses, but they spared steamer number 4 and its dock. The stench of burning petrol descended like a toxic cloud. Sulu coughed and tried to raise her free arm to protect her face. The crush pinned the arm to her side like epoxy. She thought she saw the word City Off faintly visible under the black paint smeared over the ship's name. Thangam willed herself to push through the gangway that was only yards away. It's close now. Stay close to me. Come on. A little Chinese girl just a few feet from Thangam suddenly lost her grip on her mother's hand. She quickly disappeared into the crowd. The panic-stricken mother screamed for help. Thangam caught the woman's haunted eyes. There was nothing she could do to help. The horde carried Thangam and the children away from the unfortunate woman. She thrust her boarding papers at an officer at the foot of the gangway. He waved her on without looking at the permits.
So it is actually when we listen to the cadences of this novel that we understand, the beauty of fiction and also history. Because sometimes we think that it is only fiction that can, engage us or entertain us or make us happy. But you really proved that how history and historical lines and the oral narratives have a great power in catching our attention and grabbing our attention power. So next, your book has a valuable, comment by Dr. Shashi Tharoor. So how was your book received at the various, literary platforms and literary events like this all around India or in Kerala?
It's been received pretty well. I've gotten some very good reviews from the Hindu and the Asian Review of Books and a few other publications. I have a website, theswarajspy.com. You can go to that website if you wish. It's got all the reviews in it. And the people who have read it have been very kind, and they've told me some encouraging things. So I'm pretty happy with the reception, and that it has urged me to want to write more, more such books.
We're also quite happy that we got a quite number of audience to listen to you, Vijay Balan. So next, I would like to ask you about, is it actually a serious effort from your side to uphold the forgotten history of India, or in Kerala in particular?
Very much so. I think, as I said, kind of the broader point I made was let us make an effort to learn more about our history, about our different regional histories, and so on. But there are also so many unknown stories like this one. But it doesn't have to be, something dramatic like something that happened in a war or the freedom struggle and so on. Each one of your families has histories. And once that generation before you goes, those stories are gone. So, talk to your Velyamas and Achamas and what have you, and write those stories down because they're precious. So I think preserving that, it's not only important for you to do that for yourself, but to be able to pass it on to your children, and so that they know the context of, where they came from and what they are part of. I think that's important.
So when I listened to one of your interviews that it's been uploaded, so I listened that an average Indian is still interested in listening about, knowing more about history. But I understand, or I personally believe, it's a niche of people. It's a specific tribe that is interested towards history. I think people who gather for such literature festival that's happening around in India. So do you think, apart from literature, we understand about history from, literary piece of work, but apart from literature, what do you think are the sources that is currently available, not the internet or such sites, but some other platforms that we can actually unearth what has been earthed in?
Well, I think the visual mediums can play a much greater role than they have played so far. Theatre can play a very important role. Movies can play an important role. Although there is always the risk that they will dramatize it in order to sell more tickets. Okay, so that's the risk that you go through. But it just doesn't have to be the medium of the written word published in a book. And with new media now, I mean, the internet now, people's attention spans are shrinking. Not too many people are going to sit and read a 500-page book. But having said that, this whole new format with reels and short format vehicles, little snippets of history can be conveyed. To not tell the whole story, but to plant the seed, right? To generate the interest, so that then they can then go find out more for themselves. So there's certainly a lot that can be done.
So before I conclude, I would like to ask you, were you disheartened, visiting some of the places in India, or watching or understanding how the history has been treated, like, or the museums or the archaeological sites been treated?
So yeah, as I said earlier, I mean, it is sad because some of the places are in pretty terrible shape. But having said that, I see a change. I haven't been there. I've seen videos of it, but I do want to go there. There is a museum in Patna in Bihar, which looks fabulous. It looks world class. And they have taken some of the old Mauryan pieces of art and so on, and they have displayed them as museums elsewhere in the world do. So it could be, it's also a question of resources. I mean, India today is not the India that it was 25, 30 years ago. There's much more wealth in India today, and hopefully that will be applied in ways in which, these monuments can be better maintained, and also museums and so on can be, curated at a different level than they are now.
Yeah, so there was a reference to Northeast when you talked initially. So have you been to Northeast?
No, I haven't. It's on my bucket list. I absolutely want to go to the Northeast. I'm also a student of military history, so I have pored over maps of Arunachal Pradesh, and I know every little curve on that border. And, my girls often tell me, "Oh, there goes Dad again. He's going to talk about history." So, but I do want to go to all of the Seven Sisters, and I want to visit them, and I want to understand, what those parts of the country are like. I haven't.
Thank you, Vijay. It was very interesting. I have a question more. You've touched on the importance and how you've you said you fessed up in the back of your book and your author's note about what's fiction and what you've taken creative license in changing. I just wanted to find out a little bit more about how you maintain the balance between the fictional side and the importance of maintaining historical fact in your work, especially when you're dealing with a family member that's dear to you and you want to make sure that their story is told and represented in the right way. Historical fiction, I wish I could write it. I can't, but I have great respect for historians and people that balance history and fiction. So how did you go about getting that right balance?
Well, I started out with an idea that I wasn't going to take too much of a license with this story. So I stayed as close to the facts as possible. And as I said, I only used fiction to kind of tell the story. So it wasn't that hard. As I said, the more I dug, the more incredible were the facts that were in front of me. So I didn't have to make things up. I mean, they were pretty fascinating to start with. So there were only a couple of places where I kind of just moved things for. There's one part where he escapes from a POW camp, and I moved it to a place for dramatic effect. And I've told you that in my author's notes. But to answer your specific question, my balance, I started out with the balance as being, okay, let's make it 90-10 or 80-20 or whatever in favor of the facts as opposed to the other way around. And I try to stay true to that.
Sir, could you please say something about T.P. Kumaran Nair, Shahid-e-Hind? I'm from Calicut, that's right.
Oh, you are? Okay, yeah.
Because I have an article by your relative, Ms. Sumitra Venugopal.
Okay.
She has written an article in my school magazine.
Okay, so...
about her uncle, Shahid T.P. Kumaran Nair.
Right, so...
now at present, in Calicut, nobody knows about him.
Okay. So briefly, as I said, he was my granduncle. The TP stands for the Tharavard name. It is Thekkambalathu Puthan Veedu. That's what the full Tharavard name is. And his father was a police officer. Krishna Panikar was his name. And he studied at the Zamarin College. He did his intermediate. And then he joined the Malabar Special Police. And I'll tell you one thing. I mean, I told you I got copies of the letters that he wrote. They're in beautiful English. There were letters in Malayalam as well, but a lot of the letters that he wrote to his brothers, smuggled to his brothers, are in wonderful English. That generation wrote, unlike us. I mean, we tend to tweet. So he was educated at the Zamarin College. He joined the MSP. He served for 7 years in the MSP from 1924 to 1931. And then he refused to disperse this group of protesters. These women were protesting the hanging of Bhagat Singh. So it was the day after Bhagat Singh was executed. So he said, I'm not going to attack women. That's not what I was trained for. So then he came back to Calicut. He and his brother started a car business. It was called TP Brothers. It did well initially. Then the Great Depression came. It destroyed his business. He was always kind of a very driven kind of a person, who was just almost impetuous, I would say. And my grandfather, who knew him, I used to talk to my grandfather, and my grandfather said to me, and that's there in the book, he would keep telling my granduncle, look, you're too hot-headed. Don't go just jump into things. Just be a little more measured. But that was his character. I mean, he was a very driven kind of an individual. And then the rest of the story, I've told you about how he went to Singapore and joined the INA because of the help of people like Mr. K.P.K. Menon and so on. And then the rest of the story about what happened to him, I won't tell you because that'll be a spoiler for the book. So I can talk to you more about it after this event if you wish. Huh? Okay.
So,
yes, sir.
Do we have...
Sir, a small question. So I believe you would be continuing writing. You would be having a second novel also. So what would be the genre of your next novel? Would it be historical fiction or would you be changing to some other genre?
No, I think I'm going to stay in the genre of little known history, using fiction as a vehicle, because I enjoy doing that, and it's something that I know a little bit about Indian history, so it'll probably be about little known Indian history. I know a fair amount about European history and American history as well, but I feel I'm more qualified to write about this. So it'll probably be in that genre. As to what the specific theme is going to be, I haven't figured that out yet. So.
It is actually very inspiring to write about your own great uncle as such, and you must have felt some kind of ownership, some kind of maybe you were invested in him very emotionally also, that when he does something very inspirational, you draw from it, yes, this was my, this is my blood kind of a thing. Now tomorrow you'd write a second novel, and maybe it's about somebody else. Would you feel that you would have a slight emotional disconnect, or would you still own up to it? Because she was talking about my history. When she repeated it several times, our history, my history versus their history. I mean, the whole talk is about world history. Would we still own up, say, Mehmet's conquest of Constantinople, or would we still be very, very happy only if it's our own great uncle, or if it's a Malayali or an Indian? How would you what are your thoughts about that?
That's a terrific question. As to how invested I might be in my next book from an emotional point of view, because clearly this book, there was an emotional connection, although I never met the man. It was just because of stories that I had heard of him. So yeah, chances are my next book, there may not be that much of an emotional connect. Having said that, it might actually help me, because it might give me more distance. This one, I had to fight it. I had to fight the tendency to get emotional. And I'll be honest with you, after I read those letters, I couldn't stop crying. I was crying for a long time. So it really moved me, right? So, but what I had to do was to say, okay, slap myself a few times on the face and say, okay, fine, right here. So, yeah, I guess I'll find out. I mean, I know when I write my next book, I'll be thinking of you and this question that you asked me. But I think hopefully it'll give me a little more distance, and I won't have to struggle with distancing myself from the character as much as I had to in this one.
A very quick question. I just wondered whether you would think about writing or could say something about the involvement of women in the INA.
There is a wonderful book written by Joyce Lebra. It's a non-fiction book. It's about the Jhansi Regiment. So the world's first all-woman combat regiment was with the INA. And it was headed by Dr. Lakshmi Sehgal, Subhashini's mom. So that's a great book. I think there's material there.
Your next novel?
Perhaps, yeah. And that, that actually that's a great thought, because that's another underappreciated part of the history. Those women, a lot of these were women from these states. They gave up everything. A lot of them just showed up at the INA's gates, took off their bangles and jewelry and gave it all to somebody and said, take this, and I want to join the INA. So there's so many stories there. Yes.
Okay, sir. You mentioned that you invested around 13 years to get this book published, right? Yeah, including the research and the effort to get a publisher. So there will be many such authors who invest themselves many years into a book. And then do we have a system to keep all this book intact? Means 2 generations down the line, will they get to know these books? Because their ancestors have put in a lot of effort to write such books. Like, there are many historians like you. You are not a historian as such, but there are many authors who put in years of effort to author such books. But do we have a system as a government-oriented system which preserve such books, or like an archive? Do we have a system like here in India?
No, okay, so there are archives, government archives that keep official documents, but I don't know of an archive that keeps narratives. I mean, I wish there was one, you know. There are very kind of, crude internet sites like Ancestry.com and so on, where you can upload pictures of your ancestors and write little blurbs about them. But I don't know of any archive that would keep all of these different family histories. So that may be a great idea for an internet business. You can start one and you take it public and you'll be a billionaire.
So, do we have a question? So before we conclude, I would like to ask you one more question as an addition to one of the questions that we received.
Sure.
Is actually fiction quite necessary in narrating history? Do you think like that?
Not fiction per se, but I think the narrative vehicle is important to make it interesting. This notion of the history being his story. So, and that story does not have to be completely, made up and fictional. But to make it interesting, I think telling it as a story is important.